Liberia's Supreme Court declares removal of House Speaker unconstitutional, implications for democratic integrity and international standing. Welcome back to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we unmask power and amplify the voices shaping Africa's destiny. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today we dive deep into Liberia's constitutional showdown, exposing the political storm that could shake the very foundation of its democracy and derail its campaign for a seat at the world's top table, the United Nations Security Council. Stay tuned for our in-depth analysis, Africa-wide comparisons, and forward-looking insights you won't find anywhere else. Liberia's recent political turmoil, stemming from the government's tepid response to a Supreme Court ruling, has raised significant concerns about the nation's commitment to the rule of law and its aspirations on the international stage. Judicial authority challenged. In a decisive move, Liberia's Supreme Court ruled that the actions of the self-proclaimed majority bloc in the House of Representatives, specifically their attempt to unseat Speaker J. Fonati Kofa, were unconstitutional. The court emphasized that any legislative session must adhere to constitutional procedures, including the presence of the duly elected speaker and a legitimate quorum. Despite this clear directive, President Joseph Boakai's administration has been criticized for its lackluster enforcement of the court's decision. In a national address, President Boakai stated his intention to work with a functioning quorum in the House, a stance perceived by many as aligning with the majority bloc's defiance of the judiciary. Domestic and international repercussions. The government's ambivalence has sparked a wave of criticism from legal experts, opposition parties, and civil society. Cutler Lafayette B. Gould warned that defying the Supreme Court's ruling could be construed as treasonous under Article 76 of the Liberian Constitution. Similarly, the Alternative National Congress, ANC, condemned the majority bloc's actions as a threat to Liberia's democratic order. Internationally, Liberia's bid for a non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, for the 2026-2027 term is under scrutiny. Senator Edwin Melvin Snow highlighted that the international community is closely monitoring Liberia's adherence to democratic principles, implying that the current crisis could jeopardize the nation's UNSC aspirations. Comparative analysis. Lessons from Africa. Liberia's situation is not isolated. Other African nations have faced similar challenges. In Kenya, for instance, the Supreme Court's annulment of the 2017 presidential election was met with compliance from the executive branch, reinforcing judicial independence. Conversely, Zimbabwe's judiciary has often been criticized for lacking autonomy, leading to prolonged political instability. These examples underscore the importance of respecting judicial decisions to maintain democratic integrity and international credibility. A call for constitutional fidelity for Liberia to uphold its democratic ideals and strengthen its international standing. It is imperative that the executive branch enforces the Supreme Court's ruling unequivocally. Restoring Speaker Kofa and ensuring legislative processes align with constitutional mandates will signal the nation's commitment to the rule of law. Failure to act decisively risks not only domestic unrest, but also the erosion of trust among international partners and institutions. Liberia stands at a crossroads where adherence to constitutional principles will determine its democratic trajectory and global reputation. The government's response to the Supreme Court's ruling will either reaffirm its commitment to the rule of law or cast doubt on its suitability for roles in international governance structures like the UNSC. Regional implications. Liberia and West Africa's democratic norms. Liberia's current standoff between the executive, legislature, and judiciary echoes broader regional patterns in West Africa, where tensions between state institutions often test the resilience of democratic frameworks. In recent years, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, has positioned itself as a key mediator in constitutional crises, intervening in countries like Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso following coups or democratic backsliding. For Liberia, a nation with deep historical ties to ECOWAS, any deterioration in the rule of law risks drawing regional scrutiny and intervention. Already, Senator Edwin Melvin Snow, Liberia's representative to the ECOWAS Parliament, has warned that these developments could diminish Liberia's standing within ECOWAS, potentially affecting its influence in regional decision-making processes. Africa-wide comparisons, a test for emerging democracies. Across the continent, several nations have faced similar tests of institutional independence and the rule of law. South Africa, the Constitutional Court's rulings have consistently held high-level political actors accountable, including former President Jacob Zuma, who faced contempt charges. The enforcement of judicial rulings has helped maintain South Africa's democratic credibility. Nigeria. The judiciary has historically been entangled in political affairs, with rulings on electoral disputes often perceived as politically influenced. However, in key moments, such as the 2019 presidential election petitions, the court's decisions were largely respected by state institutions. Gambia. The peaceful transition of power in 2017 after Yahya Jammeh's defeat showcased how regional and international pressure can enforce respect for democratic outcomes, though the judiciary itself played a limited role due to Jammeh's refusal to accept defeat until ECOWAS intervened militarily. Liberia's current crisis, if unresolved, risks placing the country closer to nations where judicial independence is undermined, such as Zimbabwe or Cameroon, both of which have been criticized for executive overreach and the suppression of judicial mandates. Liberia's fledgling democracy, emerging from years of civil war, requires robust institutional checks and balances to prevent relapse into instability. Safeguarding Liberia's democratic future. Looking ahead, Liberia must leverage this crisis as a turning point for institutional strengthening. Several actions could bolster its democratic framework. 1. Independent enforcement mechanism. Establishing an independent constitutional enforcement body could ensure that Supreme Court rulings are upheld without reliance solely on the executive branch. Models such as Ghana's Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice, KHRAJ, could offer guidance. 2. ECOWAS mediation. Proactive engagement with ECOWAS for constitutional mediation might restore balance among the executive, legislature, and judiciary, reaffirming Liberia's role as a democratic beacon in the region. 3. Civil society empowerment. Strengthening civil society and media oversight will be essential to holding all branches of government accountable. Liberia's post-conflict civil society has played a vital role in maintaining peace and should be mobilized to advocate for constitutional compliance. 4. Diplomatic engagement. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs should engage key international partners, including the United States, the European Union, and the African Union, to reaffirm Liberia's commitment to the rule of law. This could mitigate potential diplomatic fallout from the current impasse. Failure to implement such reforms could have significant long-term repercussions, not just for Liberia's UNSC bid, but also for its economic stability, as investors often view political stability and institutional integrity as prerequisites for economic engagement. The African Development Bank, IMF, and other international financial institutions closely monitor governance indicators as part of their engagement frameworks. The UNSC bid, Stakes Beyond Symbolism, Liberia's campaign for a non-permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, carries both symbolic and strategic weight. Beyond enhancing its diplomatic profile, securing this seat would allow Liberia to influence global peace and security decisions, reinforcing its post-conflict narrative as a stable democracy. However, UNSC candidacy also subjects Liberia to intensified scrutiny regarding its domestic governance. Historically, countries elected to the UNSC have been expected to uphold high standards of governance, human rights, and rule of law. Liberia's ongoing political impasse and the perceived erosion of judicial authority threatens to tarnish its image as a post-conflict success story. The risk is that Liberia could become emblematic of the challenges facing transitional democracies rather than a model for stability and reform. Furthermore, Liberia's standing in the UN Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review (UPR) process could be negatively affected. A poor governance record, especially concerning separation of powers and judicial independence, would likely draw critical observations from other member states during the review cycle. Growing international pressure. As of April 2025, the United States Embassy in Monrovia issued a statement urging all branches of Liberia's government to respect the rule of law and uphold constitutional governance. Similarly, the European Union delegation to Liberia called for swift and decisive action to implement the Supreme Court's ruling, framing it as a litmus test for Liberia's democratic maturity. Meanwhile, Liberia's civil society organizations have announced plans to stage peaceful protests demanding the government enforce the Supreme Court's decision. The Liberia National Bar Association, LNBA, has also called for an emergency session to deliberate on the growing constitutional crisis and recommend legal pathways for resolution. A nation at a crossroads, Liberia's unresolved legislative impasse serves as a crucial test of its commitment to democratic norms. The coming weeks will reveal whether President Boakai's administration is prepared to make the hard choices required to align with constitutional mandates, or whether political expediency will undermine both domestic stability and international aspirations. Economic consequences, governance, and investor confidence. Liberia's internal political strife does not exist in isolation. It directly affects the nation's economic outlook. The perception of political instability and disregard for the rule of law can erode investor confidence, triggering capital flight, stalling foreign direct investment, FDI, and complicating relationships with key international financial institutions. According to the World Bank's 2024 Doing Business Index, Liberia was making incremental progress in improving its business environment, especially in areas such as starting a business and resolving insolvency. However, these gains remain fragile. Political instability, especially one that calls into question the legitimacy of the legislative process, can deter investment in critical sectors such as mining, agriculture, and infrastructure, where Liberia relies on foreign capital. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, which has a current extended credit facility, ECF, arrangement with Liberia, is known to monitor governance issues closely as part of its program reviews. A breakdown in constitutional governance could delay disbursements, tightening fiscal space and restricting the government's ability to meet public sector obligations, including salaries, healthcare, and education. Additionally, credit rating agencies, such as Moody's and Fitch, have flagged political risk as a key determinant in assessing sovereign creditworthiness for emerging economies. Any downgrade in Liberia's credit rating could lead to higher borrowing costs and further strain public finances. The private sector, including telecommunications, banking, and mining, has also expressed concern over the uncertainty generated by the ongoing political impasse. Prolonged instability risks delaying critical infrastructure projects such as road networks, energy expansion, and port development, initiatives that are crucial for economic diversification and poverty reduction. Comparative economic impact, West African precedents. Drawing parallels from the region, countries like Guinea and Mali offer cautionary tales. Both nations faced sharp declines in foreign investment and aid following constitutional crises and military takeovers. Guinea, after the 2021 coup, saw a 30% drop in FDI within a year, according to UNCTAD. Similarly, Mali's economic growth contracted by 2.5% in the immediate aftermath of its 2020 political crisis. On the other hand, Ghana, despite facing significant economic challenges, maintained investor confidence due in part to its robust institutional framework and respect for judicial processes. The Ghanaian example illustrates how adherence to the rule of law can provide a buffer against external shocks, reassuring investors even amid fiscal pressures. Liberia's economy, still recovering from the dual shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic and commodity price volatility, cannot afford a governance-induced economic downturn. As such, ensuring constitutional compliance is not just a political imperative, but an economic necessity. International relations, Liberia's place in the global order. Beyond economic considerations, Liberia's failure to resolve this crisis could strain its diplomatic relations, particularly with key Western allies and multilateral organizations. Liberia has long been viewed as a post-conflict success story, leveraging this narrative to secure development aid, debt relief, and technical assistance. If Liberia is perceived as backsliding on governance, major donors such as the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, the European Union, EU, and the World Bank could reassess their engagement strategies. This might translate into conditionalities on future aid disbursements or even funding freezes for governance-related programs. Furthermore, Liberia's UN Peacebuilding Commission, PBC partnership, which provides strategic support for sustaining peace, could be jeopardized. The PBC has repeatedly emphasized the importance of constitutional governance as a cornerstone of long-term peacebuilding. Internationally, Liberia's diplomatic ambitions, especially its UNSC bid, could suffer reputational damage. The African Group at the United Nations, which plays a crucial role in endorsing African candidates for the UNSC, typically weighs governance performance and regional stability when selecting candidates. Any perception that Liberia is flouting democratic norms could prompt competing bids from nations with stronger governance records, such as Namibia or Botswana. The role of civil society and media, guardians of democracy. Liberia's vibrant civil society and independent media have historically played a pivotal role in safeguarding democracy and human rights. During the country's post-war reconstruction, organizations such as the Center for Transparency and Accountability in Liberia, CENTAL, and Integrity Watch Liberia have monitored governance reforms, exposing corruption and advocating for institutional integrity. In this current crisis, these groups have intensified their advocacy, urging the government to enforce the Supreme Court ruling and protect the constitutional order. Likewise, Liberia's independent media outlets, including Front Page Africa and the Daily Observer, continue to provide critical coverage, keeping the public informed and holding power to account. The resilience of these institutions will be crucial in shaping public opinion and mobilizing civic action. Peaceful protests, advocacy campaigns, and international partnerships could pressure the Boakai Kung administration to realign with constitutional principles. Youth and public sentiment, a brewing discontent. Liberia's youthful population, more than 60% under the age of 25, remains particularly sensitive to political and economic instability. For many, the post-war promise of democratic governance was a cornerstone of their aspirations for a better future. The perception that political elites are once again undermining these foundations risks fueling disillusionment and unrest. Already, there are reports of youth-led advocacy groups preparing to stage peaceful demonstrations demanding the enforcement of the Supreme Court's ruling. If left unresolved, this discontent could escalate into wider protests, reminiscent of the 2019 Save the State protests that drew thousands into the streets demanding economic and governance reforms. Liberia's political leadership must recognize that ignoring the voice of the youth risks widening the gap between the government and the governed, a dangerous prospect in a fragile democracy. Potential scenarios: Liberia's diplomatic calculus. Amid governance challenges, as Liberia navigates this complex constitutional crisis, multiple scenarios could unfold, each with far-reaching implications for its UNSC bid, economic stability, and democratic resilience. 1. Scenario 1. Full compliance with the Supreme Court. Ruling should President Boakai's administration decide to enforce the court's decision, recognizing Speaker J. Fonati Kofa, as the legitimate leader of the House of Representatives, Liberia could begin to rebuild domestic trust and bolster its international credibility. This action would likely ease tensions with civil society, stabilize the legislative process, and send a positive signal to international partners, enhancing Liberia's chances in its UNSC campaign. Drawing parallels, Kenya's Supreme Court annulled the 2017 presidential election, and President Uhuru Kenyatta accepted the decision, which reinforced Kenya's image as a nation respecting judicial independence. Liberia could follow a similar path, positioning itself as a regional exemplar of constitutional fidelity. 2. Scenario 2. Continued defiance and legislative paralysis. If the Boakai administration maintains its ambiguous stance, working with the disputed quorum in the legislature, this could prolong the constitutional deadlock. Such a scenario risks escalating political tensions, fostering civil unrest, and undermining Liberia's economic prospects. Moreover, ECOWAS and the African Union, AU, may be compelled to intervene, either diplomatically or through sanctions, as they have done in other instances of democratic erosion, including Mali and Guinea. Liberia's UNSC bid would almost certainly falter in this context, as global powers prioritize stable governance structures when endorsing candidates for influential international positions. 3. Scenario 3. Regional and international mediation. Recognizing the gravity of the crisis, ECOWAS, with backing from the AU and UN Peacebuilding Commission, could step in to mediate a resolution. This approach, while potentially delaying immediate outcomes, might facilitate a sustainable compromise between the branches of government, reinforcing Liberia's democratic framework. Sierra Leone's 2018 electoral dispute presents a useful parallel, where mediation by regional bodies prevented escalation, ensuring the peaceful transfer of power. Role of ECOWAS, a balancing act. As a principal guarantor of peace and democracy in West Africa, ECOWAS has both the mandate and precedent for intervening in constitutional crises. Its Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance 2001 explicitly outlines that respect for the rule of law and judicial independence are non-negotiable principles for member states. Liberia, as a founding member of ECOWAS, is expected to uphold these standards. ECOWAS has leveraged its authority in the past to stabilize fragile political environments, including mediating the Gambian transition in 2017 and imposing sanctions on Mali's military junta in 2021. Should Liberia's leadership fail to enforce the Supreme Court ruling, ECOWAS could initiate dialogue, send envoys, or apply diplomatic pressure, though military intervention remains a last resort. The African Union, quiet diplomacy or active engagement. The African Union, AU, which operates under its Constitutive Act to promote democratic principles, may also engage in Liberia's crisis. Historically, the AU's response to governance challenges has varied, ranging from direct condemnation, as seen in coup scenarios, to more measured, behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Given Liberia's post-conflict history and significance as a symbol of Africa's democratic renaissance, the AU might view this crisis as an opportunity to reinforce its democratic norms. However, the AU's current focus on more acute crises, such as those in Sudan, Niger, and Ethiopia, might delay its direct engagement unless the situation escalates dramatically. UNSC bid, competing interests, and diplomatic maneuvering. Liberia's aspirations for a non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council 2026-2027 are at a delicate juncture. Gaining the support of the African Group at the UN, which traditionally rotates representation among African subregions, requires demonstrating not only political stability, but also a commitment to peace and security, both domestically and regionally. Competing nations, such as Namibia and Botswana, which have consistently demonstrated stronger governance records, could capitalize on Liberia's current turmoil to advance their own candidacies. Furthermore, major global powers, especially the United States, China, and France, are unlikely to endorse a candidate mired in constitutional controversy, given the UNSC's critical role in upholding international peace and security. In past UNSC elections, the quality of governance has played a decisive role. For instance, South Africa's robust institutional framework contributed to its successful bids in 2011, 2012, and 2019-2020. Liberia risks undermining its campaign unless it swiftly resolves its internal governance crisis. Implications for peace and security, Liberia's post-conflict fragility. Beyond the corridors of international diplomacy, Liberia's internal crisis threatens to unravel the delicate peace the country has sustained since the Accra Peace Agreement ended its civil war in 2003. While Liberia has avoided major conflict in the post-war era, the institutional weaknesses exposed by this legislative impasse reveal latent vulnerabilities. Historical patterns in West Africa suggest that unresolved governance crises can morph into broader security challenges, especially in states with fragile institutions. Liberia's security sector reform (SSR) process, supported by the United Nations mission in Liberia, UNMIL, until its withdrawal in 2018, was designed to ensure that the country's security forces remain apolitical and responsive to civilian authority. However, as the political crisis deepens, concerns are mounting that factions within the security services could be drawn into the dispute, especially if mass protests or civil disobedience escalate. Such developments could reverse hard-won gains in Liberia's peace-building process, posing risks not only for national stability, but also for regional security. Security sector vulnerabilities. A fragile peace at risk. The integrity of Liberia's security sector, particularly the Armed Forces of Liberia, AFL, and the Liberia National Police, LNP, remains one of the most critical pillars supporting the nation's post-conflict stability. While these institutions have undergone significant reforms with international backing, including training from UNMIL, the United States, and other partners, their ability to remain neutral in politically charged crises is now being tested. Historically, in West African states facing constitutional crises, the security sector's allegiance, or lack thereof, to civilian authority has often determined whether conflicts escalate into violence. Guinea-Bissau, for instance, has witnessed frequent military interference in politics, undermining democratic processes. Liberia's AFL, though restructured, still grapples with the legacies of its wartime past, where security forces were deeply politicized and often aligned with factional leaders. If the current political standoff intensifies, especially if protests swell or the defiance of the Supreme Court persists, there is a risk that factions within the LNP or AFL could be drawn into the fray, either to suppress dissent or to protect certain political interests. This could unravel the fragile peace Liberia has sustained since 2003. International partners like ECOWAS, the United Nations, and the United States remain vital in reinforcing the apolitical nature of Liberia's security forces. Continued diplomatic engagement and security cooperation, including capacity-building initiatives and dialogue facilitation, are essential to prevent any military or police interference in civilian politics. The role of religious and traditional leaders, guardians of social cohesion. Another critical but often under-acknowledged factor in Liberia's stability is the influence of religious and traditional leaders. During the country's civil wars and subsequent peace-building phases, these actors played a crucial role in mediating conflicts, fostering reconciliation, and promoting nonviolence. As the political impasse deepens, Liberia's Inter-Religious Council, IRC, and Council of Chiefs and Elders could become instrumental in brokering dialogue between the executive, judiciary, and legislature. Their moral authority, rooted in long-standing community trust, positions them uniquely to mediate political disputes without appearing partisan. In the Gambian crisis of 2016-2017, religious and traditional leaders appealed directly to former President Yahya Jammeh, urging him to accept the electoral results. Liberia's leadership may similarly benefit from engaging these groups to reduce tensions and seek a peaceful resolution. However, if these influential figures remain sidelined or divided along political lines, the social fabric could fray, exacerbating polarization at the grassroots level. Liberia's history of ethnic divisions, though less pronounced in this crisis, still looms as a latent risk factor. Youth and social media, catalysts for change or unrest. Liberia's youth population, empowered by social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp, has become a potent political force capable of shaping narratives and mobilizing action. Social media was pivotal during the 2019 Save the State protests, which called for governance reforms and accountability from the George Weah administration. In the current context, social media continues to amplify calls for constitutional compliance and judicial respect. However, it also serves as a conduit for misinformation and disinformation, which could fuel unrest or deepen divisions if not properly managed. The government, civil society, and international partners must collaborate to ensure that digital spaces remain venues for constructive dialogue rather than incitement. This could include media literacy campaigns, fact-checking initiatives, and dialogue forums that engage youth in peaceful advocacy. Failure to engage the youth meaningfully risks alienating a generation that has known only the promises of democracy and peace-building since the Civil War's end. Disillusioned youth movements, combined with economic frustrations, could become a flashpoint for wider social upheaval. Human rights at stake. A warning from recent history. As the political standoff lingers, human rights organizations have begun to voice concerns about the potential erosion of civil liberties. The Liberia Independent Human Rights Commission, LIHRC, has warned that the politicization of the legislative crisis could lead to arbitrary arrests, restrictions on peaceful assembly, and targeted harassment of opposition voices. Such actions, if they materialize, could damage Liberia's international reputation, particularly within the UN Human Rights Council framework, where Liberia is subject to periodic reviews. Human rights violations, even perceived ones, could trigger sanctions or aid suspensions from key partners like the European Union or the United States, both of which place strong emphasis on democratic governance and human rights adherence. The recent experiences of Uganda and Zimbabwe, where human rights abuses have led to international isolation and sanctions, should serve as cautionary tales for Liberia's leadership. The role of the judiciary. Strengthening or weakening precedent. Beyond the immediate political crisis, the longer-term implications for Liberia's judiciary are profound. If the Supreme Court's ruling remains unenforced, the precedent could embolden future defiance of court decisions, weakening the judiciary's role as a co-equal branch of government. This erosion of judicial authority could have ripple effects across Liberia's legal system, affecting everything from commercial dispute resolution to human rights enforcement. To strengthen the judiciary's independence and ensure compliance with its rulings, Liberia may need to consider institutional reforms such as clarifying enforcement mechanisms for Supreme Court decisions, establishing contempt provisions with clear, enforceable penalties, providing greater budgetary autonomy for the judiciary, insulating it from executive or legislative interference. Models from South Africa, where the judiciary enjoys high levels of independence and enforcement capacity, could offer useful insights for Liberia. However, if judicial rulings become symbolic gestures without real-world consequences, Liberia risks drifting toward the governance patterns seen in Cameroon or Togo, where courts are perceived as extensions of executive power, leading to chronic political instability. Global diplomatic responses, mounting pressure, and strategic engagement. As Liberia's political standoff persists, international diplomatic actors have begun to take a more active stance. The United States, Liberia's historical ally and major development partner, has expressed growing concern over the government's handling of the Supreme Court ruling. In a recent press briefing, the U.S. State Department emphasized the importance of respecting judicial independence as a cornerstone of democratic governance. The U.S. Embassy in Monrovia reiterated this stance, warning that continued disregard for constitutional processes could affect Liberia's standing as a valued partner in international forums. This subtle yet pointed remark underscores Washington's expectation for Liberia to resolve its internal governance challenges in line with democratic norms. Similarly, the European Union delegation to Liberia issued a statement urging all political actors to respect the rule of law and the decisions of the judiciary. The EU stressed that adherence to democratic principles remains a critical factor in sustaining development cooperation, including the disbursement of funds under the EU-Liberia Partnership Agreement. The United Nations, while traditionally cautious in its public statements on internal political affairs, has echoed these concerns. The UN resident coordinator in Liberia, speaking during a recent governance forum in Monrovia, emphasized that a credible commitment to constitutional order is vital for Liberia's continued engagement with the international community, including its aspirations at the United Nations. The African Union, though yet to issue a formal statement, is reportedly monitoring the situation closely through its Peace and Security Council. Behind closed doors, AU diplomats have expressed unease about the precedent Liberia's case might set, especially given the AU's focus on promoting constitutional governance across the continent. China and other emerging powers, a calculated silence. In contrast, China, which has increased its economic footprint in Liberia through investments in infrastructure and mining, has maintained a strategic silence. While Beijing traditionally refrains from commenting on internal governance issues in partner states, Liberia's political instability could affect ongoing projects and bilateral relations. For instance, the China-Liberia Mineral Development Agreement, which includes multi-million-dollar investments in iron ore and road infrastructure, could face delays if political uncertainty disrupts parliamentary processes needed for approvals and oversight. Similarly, India, which has emerging trade interests in Liberia's agriculture and technology sectors, is watching the situation unfold, balancing its economic diplomacy with cautious engagement on governance matters. The UN Security Council bid, a litmus test for Liberia's diplomacy. As the 2026-2027 UN Security Council elections approach, Liberia's diplomatic corps faces an uphill battle to maintain its candidacy. While West Africa is due for another rotational seat, Liberia's governance record could become a decisive factor. The African Union's endorsement, which Liberia seeks to secure by mid-2025, may now hinge on the resolution of the current constitutional crisis. Competing nations such as Senegal, Namibia, and Botswana offer strong governance records and could lobby against Liberia's bid if the crisis continues. Moreover, global powers on the Security Council, including the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, typically weigh governance performance in their considerations. Liberia's strategic alignment with these powers, especially in peacekeeping and regional diplomacy, could be undermined if the current dispute escalates. A broader reflection, governance as soft power. In the broader landscape of international diplomacy, governance is increasingly viewed as an element of soft power. Nations that exhibit strong democratic institutions, uphold human rights, and maintain judicial independence tend to wield greater influence in global forums. Liberia, once celebrated as Africa's first republic and a symbol of post-conflict recovery, risks eroding its soft power if it allows the current impasse to fester. Its historic role as a UN peacekeeping contributor and regional peace advocate, such as in Ivory Coast and Sierra Leone, could be overshadowed by perceptions of democratic backsliding. At the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA, where Liberia has consistently advocated for African development and peace building, this diminished credibility could translate into fewer alliances, reduced influence in negotiations, and challenges in multilateral cooperation. Strategic recommendations, pathways for restoring confidence. To navigate this precarious situation and restore both domestic and international confidence, Liberia's leadership could consider the following strategic actions. 1. Immediate enforcement of the Supreme Court. Ruling. President Boakai's administration must unequivocally implement the court's decision, reinstating Speaker J. Fanati Kofa and ensuring the legislature functions within constitutional parameters. 2. Facilitate inclusive dialogue. Convene a national dialogue platform, engaging all political actors, civil society, religious leaders, and youth representatives to chart a consensus-driven path forward. This could mirror the Senegalese national dialogue model, which successfully addressed electoral reforms. 3. Engage ECOWAS and AU for mediation. Proactively invite ECOWAS and AU envoys to facilitate a peaceful resolution, signaling Liberia's commitment to regional democratic norms. This would also preempt external sanctions or diplomatic isolation. 4. Strengthen judicial independence. Propose legal reforms that enhance the judiciary's enforcement mechanisms, ensuring that future rulings cannot be defied without consequence. 5. Communicate a clear diplomatic strategy. Launch a diplomatic charm offensive targeting key UNSC stakeholders to reassure them of Liberia's stability and commitment to governance. Transparency about reform timelines and crisis resolution efforts would be crucial. 6. Leverage civil society as peace ambassadors. Partner with trusted civil society organizations and religious bodies to promote national unity campaigns, emphasizing nonviolence, respect for institutions, and social cohesion. The road ahead, Liberia's defining moment. Liberia's unfolding constitutional crisis represents more than a domestic dispute. It is a defining moment that could reshape the country's democratic trajectory and global standing. The coming months will be pivotal in determining whether Liberia reasserts its role as a beacon of post-conflict recovery and democratic governance, or whether it risks joining the ranks of fragile states struggling to uphold the rule of law. The international community, while offering support, will also judge Liberia by its actions. In the intricate dance of diplomacy, governance, and peace-building, Liberia must step forward with conviction, recognizing that its internal decisions reverberate far beyond its borders. Regional security risk assessment. Liberia's fragility in a volatile West African context. Liberia's current political standoff, if unresolved, does not only threaten its internal stability, but could also have ripple effects across the West African sub-region, a zone already grappling with democratic backsliding, insurgencies, and political instability. The Mono River Union, MRU, comprising Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire, has historically faced interlinked security challenges. Political instability in one member state often spills over into others, triggering refugee flows, cross-border crime, and economic disruptions. Given Liberia's porous borders and fragile institutions, an escalation of the current constitutional crisis could exacerbate regional vulnerabilities. 1. Cross-border impacts and refugee risks. Should Liberia's crisis spiral into civil unrest or prolonged instability, neighboring countries, particularly Sierra Leone and Guinea, could experience refugee inflows, reminiscent of the 1990s and early 2000s during Liberia's civil wars. Already, Guinea is managing internal political tensions, and an influx of Liberian refugees could strain its limited resources and further destabilize the region. 2. Increased organized crime and smuggling. West Africa remains a critical transit hub for illicit trafficking networks, including drugs, arms, and human trafficking. Political instability in Liberia could weaken border controls and law enforcement, creating safe havens for these networks to expand operations. Similar dynamics unfolded in Guinea-Bissau, where governance breakdowns facilitated the growth of narco-trafficking routes. 3. Terrorism and violent extremism. Spillover. While Liberia itself has not been directly impacted by violent extremist groups like Boko Haram or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, the fragility of state institutions creates vulnerabilities that extremist actors could exploit. The Sahel region, just north of Liberia, has seen insurgent activities expand southward, with incidents reported in Côte d'Ivoire and Benin. A destabilized Liberia could inadvertently contribute to creating corridors for the movement of extremist elements. 4. ECOWAS. Security architecture at risk. Liberia's situation poses a direct challenge to ECOWAS's security framework, particularly the ECOWAS Standby Force, ESF, which is tasked with maintaining regional peace and security. The sub-region is already strained by multiple military interventions and political crises, including ongoing instability in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Should Liberia's crisis escalate, ECOWAS's capacity to respond effectively could be overstretched. Preventing a security spiral, strategic interventions. To prevent Liberia's political impasse from escalating into a regional security threat, multi-level interventions are essential. Strengthening MRU collaboration. The Mono River Union Secretariat should intensify cross-border security dialogues, focusing on joint border patrols, information sharing, and early warning systems. Drawing lessons from past crises, MRU member states could develop contingency plans for refugee management and cross-border conflict prevention. ECOWAS preventive diplomacy. ECOWAS, leveraging its early warning and response network, ECOWARN, should closely monitor Liberia's situation, deploying envoys or peace missions preemptively if signs of violence emerge. Preventive diplomacy, rather than reactive intervention, would be a cost-effective and stabilizing approach. AU-ECOWAS. Collaboration. The African Union and ECOWAS should coordinate to avoid duplication and enhance the effectiveness of peace-building efforts. The AU's Continental Early Warning System, CEWS, and Panel of the Wise could complement ECOWAS initiatives by offering additional mediation capacity and technical support. International security support. Liberia could request technical assistance and capacity-building support from international partners such as the United Nations Office for West Africa and the Sahel, UNOWAS, the United States Africa Command, AFRICOM, and France's Operation Barkhane. Though Liberia is not directly in the Sahel, maintaining a stable periphery supports broader regional security. Economic recovery, post-crisis, rebuilding investor confidence. Parallel to security concerns, Liberia's pathway to economic recovery, especially after resolving the political impasse, will hinge on its ability to restore investor confidence and rebuild governance credibility. Post-crisis recovery will require a comprehensive economic stabilization plan that addresses both immediate shocks and long-term structural weaknesses. Key strategies could include 1. Governance reforms and anti-corruption drive. Post-crisis, Liberia must reaffirm its commitment to transparency and anti-corruption measures. This could involve strengthening the Liberia Anti-Corruption Commission, LACC, enhancing public procurement transparency, and improving the judiciary's capacity to handle corruption cases efficiently. 2. Re-engagement with international financial institutions, IFIs. Following a resolution of the political crisis, Liberia should seek renewed engagement with the IMF, World Bank, and African Development Bank, AFDB. These institutions could assist in crafting a post-crisis economic recovery program, including budgetary support, technical assistance, and policy guidance. 3. Diversifying the economy. Liberia's economy remains overly dependent on extractive industries, rubber, iron ore, gold, making it vulnerable to global commodity price shocks. The crisis presents an opportunity to diversify into sectors such as agriculture value chains, tourism, and digital economy development, leveraging its youthful population. 4. Public-private partnerships, PPPs. To address infrastructure gaps, the government could promote PPPs in energy, roads, ports, and telecommunications, offering incentives that de-risk private investments. This approach would ease the fiscal burden on the state while stimulating growth. 5. Diaspora engagement. Liberia's diaspora, particularly in the United States and Europe, remains an untapped reservoir of investment and technical expertise. A diaspora bond program or investment incentives for diaspora entrepreneurs could inject much-needed capital into key sectors, while also strengthening national cohesion. 6. Youth employment initiatives. Addressing the youth employment challenge will be pivotal for social stability. Post-crisis recovery programs could focus on vocational training, entrepreneurship development, and agriculture modernization, creating pathways for job creation. Donor coordination mechanisms, aligning post-crisis recovery with international support for Liberia to effectively rebound from the current political crisis and catalyze sustainable development. Donor coordination will be paramount. Liberia's heavy reliance on external funding for infrastructure, healthcare, education, and governance reform necessitates a structured framework for engaging development partners, ensuring alignment with national priorities while enhancing transparency and accountability. 1. Reinvigorating the Liberia Development Alliance, LDA. The Liberia Development Alliance, once a central platform for donor-government dialogue, could be revitalized as a donor coordination forum post-crisis. This platform should facilitate regular consultations between the government, international partners, and civil society to ensure that aid flows are aligned with Liberia's post-crisis recovery plan, avoiding duplication of efforts and enhancing impact. 2. Harmonizing aid with Liberia's pro-poor Agenda for Prosperity and Development, PAPD. Liberia's pro-poor Agenda for Prosperity and Development, 2018 to 2023, though reaching the end of its cycle, can serve as a foundation for developing a new national development strategy that reflects post-crisis priorities. Donors, including USAID, EU, World Bank, and AFDB, typically align their programs with national plans. A recalibrated PAPD 2.0, integrated with governance reforms and economic diversification, could attract renewed donor commitments. 3. Implementing multi-donor trust funds, MDTF. Liberia could explore establishing or expanding multi-donor trust funds, pooled financing mechanisms that allow multiple donors to contribute to common development objectives. An example is the Liberia Reconstruction Trust Fund, LRTF, used for post-war recovery. A similar structure could support governance, infrastructure, and economic resilience initiatives post-crisis, managed transparently to build donor confidence. 4. Enhancing monitoring and evaluation, M&E systems. To assure donors of effective utilization of funds, Liberia should invest in strengthening monitoring and evaluation frameworks. This includes leveraging digital tools for real-time data tracking, independent audits, and engaging civil society in oversight. Examples from Rwanda's Imihigo performance contracts and Ghana's Citizens Budget portal illustrate how transparency and resource allocation can boost donor trust and improve public service delivery. 5. Leveraging South-South cooperation. Beyond traditional Western donors, Liberia could deepen partnerships with emerging economies through South-South cooperation. China, India, Brazil, and Turkey have increasingly engaged in infrastructure, agriculture, and capacity-building programs across Africa. Diversifying Liberia's development partnerships could mitigate dependency risks while enhancing technical expertise. Rebranding Liberia's international image, soft power, and public diplomacy. In the aftermath of its constitutional crisis, Liberia must embark on a deliberate soft power strategy to rebuild its international image as a stable democratic nation committed to peace-building and regional cooperation. 1. Cultural diplomacy and diaspora engagement. Liberia's rich cultural heritage, including its indigenous traditions, historic ties to the African American diaspora, and post-conflict peace-building story, offers powerful tools for cultural diplomacy. Initiatives such as Liberian cultural festivals abroad, diaspora investment summits, and academic exchanges can reinforce Liberia's soft power. The Liberian diaspora could also serve as cultural ambassadors, showcasing Liberia's resilience and potential on global platforms. Programs like diaspora volunteerism and diaspora diplomacy missions could strengthen these ties. 2. Peacekeeping contributions and regional leadership. Liberia's participation in regional peacekeeping efforts, such as ECOWAS missions, should be highlighted as evidence of its commitment to peace and security. Expanding Liberia's role in regional mediation, perhaps offering to mediate in Guinea or Sierra Leone electoral disputes, could further bolster its credentials as a stabilizing force in West Africa. 3. Showcasing democratic resilience at global forums. Liberia should seize opportunities at the African Union, United Nations, and regional summits to showcase its commitment to judicial independence and constitutional governance once the crisis is resolved. Crafting compelling narratives about how Liberia addressed its constitutional challenges could transform a perceived weakness into a strength. For example, Gambia's peaceful transition in 2017, following Yahya Jammeh's defeat and subsequent exile, has been presented in international forums as a model of democratic resilience, despite the initial crisis. 4. Leveraging media and strategic communication. Liberia's Ministry of Information, Cultural Affairs, and Tourism, MICAT, in collaboration with civil society and international PR firms, could craft a strategic communication plan targeting global media outlets, think tanks, and influencers. This could include op-eds in the New York Times, BBC interviews, and participation in World Economic Forum panels aimed at reshaping global perceptions. 5. Environmental diplomacy. Liberia's rainforests and biodiversity hotspots, part of the Upper Guinean forest ecosystem, position it as a key player in global environmental diplomacy. By committing to sustainable forestry, climate resilience, and carbon credit programs, Liberia can engage in international climate forums as a partner in green growth and climate finance. Examples include Gabon's leadership in carbon credit markets and Costa Rica's reforestation success, which have garnered international acclaim and funding. Scenario building. Liberia's economic trajectory post-crisis. The shape of Liberia's economic recovery following the resolution of its constitutional crisis will depend heavily on the speed, depth, and credibility of the government's actions. Several possible trajectories could emerge, each with varying implications for growth, employment, investor confidence, and social stability. Scenario 1. Rapid stabilization and reform-driven growth. In this optimistic scenario, the Boakai administration enforces the Supreme Court ruling, restores constitutional order, and initiates a broad package of governance reforms. This triggers renewed engagement with international financial institutions and donors, leading to the rapid mobilization of budgetary support, debt relief extensions, and foreign direct investment. Economic growth. GDP growth could accelerate to 5 to 6% annually within 3 years, driven by infrastructure investments, agriculture expansion, and renewed extractive sector activities. Investor confidence would rebound, reflected in a narrowing sovereign bond spread and improved credit ratings from agencies like Moody's or Fitch. Employment. The government could roll out labor-intensive public works programs, focusing on road construction, rural electrification, and sanitation, helping to reduce youth unemployment, which remains above 60%. Poverty reduction. With renewed growth and increased social spending, Liberia could achieve modest poverty reduction, improving its Human Development Index (HDI) ranking. Regional influence. Liberia's standing within ECOWAS and the African Union would strengthen, enhancing its chances for UNSC membership while positioning it as a peace-building leader in the Mono River region. Scenario 2. Protracted crisis and economic stagnation. In this more pessimistic scenario, the government fails to resolve the political standoff promptly, leading to sustained uncertainty. Civil unrest could escalate, deterring foreign investment and development aid, while donor fatigue sets in. Economic growth. Liberia's GDP growth could stagnate or contract, remaining below 2% annually, driven by declining commodity exports, capital flight, and reduced aid flows. Inflationary pressures might mount as exchange rate depreciation accelerates, particularly if political uncertainty triggers a run on the Liberian dollar. Employment and social unrest. With economic stagnation, unemployment would rise, and urban poverty could worsen, especially in Monrovia and other major cities. Rising cost of living pressures could trigger more frequent protests, compounding instability. Debt distress. Liberia's debt-to-GDP ratio, already hovering near 50%, could worsen as revenues fall short, risking debt distress and complicating relations with the IMF and World Bank. Regional fallout. Liberia's ECOWAS and AU standing could suffer, and its UNSC bid would likely collapse. There could also be spillover effects into neighboring Guinea and Sierra Leone, especially if conflict escalates. Scenario 3. Gradual recovery with governance compromises. In this middle ground scenario, Liberia manages to resolve the political impasse, but only after delayed enforcement and compromises between warring political factions. Governance reforms proceed unevenly, but there is enough stability to prevent economic collapse. Economic growth. Growth would remain moderate, between 3 to 4% annually, supported by existing extractive projects and donor-funded programs, but structural weaknesses, such as a narrow export base and low productivity, persist. Investment climate. While foreign direct investment would return cautiously, investors may demand higher risk premiums, reflected in elevated borrowing costs and delayed infrastructure projects. Social conditions. Youth unemployment and rural poverty would remain high, posing a long-term challenge for social cohesion and political stability. The government would likely rely on short-term donor-funded social safety nets to prevent widespread unrest. International relations. Liberia's UNSC campaign would proceed, but face stiff competition from stronger governance contenders. The country could maintain its ECOWAS and AU memberships, albeit with diminished influence. Peace-building lessons from Africa. Models for Liberia's recovery. To ensure a sustainable peace-building process, Liberia could draw lessons from other African nations that have successfully navigated post-crisis recovery. 1. Sierra Leone's transitional justice and governance reform, post-2002. Following its civil war, Sierra Leone implemented transitional justice mechanisms, including a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, and a special court, which helped build trust in the rule of law. Liberia could adopt similar approaches to strengthen judicial independence and address grievances stemming from the current impasse. 2. Rwanda's governance and development model. Rwanda's emphasis on institutional reforms, accountability, and citizen participation through mechanisms like Imihigo performance contracts and Gacaca courts demonstrates the importance of grassroots engagement. Liberia could adapt these systems to foster community-level accountability and service delivery improvements. 3. Ghana's electoral reform processes. Ghana's Electoral Commission, EC, enjoys relative independence and public trust, thanks to regular institutional reforms and civic education campaigns. Liberia's National Elections Commission, NEC, could undergo similar restructuring to bolster confidence ahead of future elections. 4. South Africa's social dialogue platforms. Post-apartheid South Africa institutionalized social dialogue through bodies like the National Economic Development and Labor Council, NEDLAC, which brings together government, business, labor, and civil society to forge consensus on major policies. Liberia could establish a National Dialogue Council to ensure broad-based input on governance reforms and economic policies. 5. Tunisia's National Dialogue Quartet. Following its 2011 revolution, Tunisia avoided political collapse through a National Dialogue Quartet, which brokered agreements between secular and Islamist forces. Liberia could replicate such dialogue formats to address the legislative impasse and ensure inclusive governance. Liberia's role in regional peacekeeping and security cooperation, reinforcing credibility. Beyond its internal governance and economic challenges, Liberia's contribution to regional peacekeeping and security cooperation serves as a critical tool for rebuilding its international credibility. Historically, Liberia has both been a beneficiary of and contributor to peacekeeping operations in West Africa, particularly through ECOWAS mechanisms. Strengthening and expanding this role could help Liberia reassert itself as a regional stabilizer and enhance its candidacy for UNSC membership. 1. Reinvigorating participation in ECOWAS Standby Force, ESF. Liberia's continued participation in the ECOWAS Standby Force, even in non-combat roles such as logistics, medical support, and election observation missions would demonstrate its commitment to regional security. Given the instability in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, Liberia could offer specialized units or experts to assist in post-conflict stabilization missions, contributing to collective security frameworks. 2. Expanding contributions to UN peacekeeping missions. Liberia's experience with UNMIL could be leveraged to contribute to UN peacekeeping missions elsewhere in Africa or globally. Even limited troop contributions or civilian experts, e.g., in justice reform or security sector governance, would elevate Liberia's diplomatic profile. Countries such as Ghana, Ethiopia, and Senegal have enhanced their global standing through consistent peacekeeping contributions, influencing UN decision-making processes. 3. Hosting regional security dialogues. Liberia could position itself as a hub for regional security dialogues by hosting ECOWAS peace and security conferences or bilateral security summits with neighboring countries. These forums could focus on cross-border security, anti-trafficking initiatives, terrorism prevention, and maritime security, especially given Liberia's significant Atlantic coastline. 4. Engaging in joint training exercises. Liberia could collaborate with neighboring militaries, international partners like AFRICOM, and the French Sahel mission to conduct joint military exercises aimed at enhancing interoperability, crisis response, and counterinsurgency skills. These exercises not only improve operational readiness, but also serve as diplomatic signals of Liberia's commitment to regional peace. 5. Enhancing civil-military relations. Liberia's security sector reform, SSR, process remains fragile. Strengthening civil-military relations, ensuring oversight mechanisms, and promoting gender inclusion within the armed forces would align Liberia's military posture with democratic norms. Ghana's SSR framework, which emphasizes civilian oversight and non-partisanship, offers a valuable model. Sectoral priorities for long-term economic resilience. For Liberia to transition from fragility to resilience, targeted investment and reform in key economic sectors beyond natural resource extraction are essential. Focusing on agriculture, mining, energy, and digital economy development could diversify the economic base, enhance employment generation, and insulate Liberia from commodity price shocks. Agriculture, the backbone of inclusive growth current state. Agriculture remains Liberia's largest employer, accounting for over 70% of livelihoods, yet the sector is dominated by subsistence farming and low productivity. Despite fertile lands and abundant rainfall, Liberia imports a significant portion of its food, exacerbating trade deficits. Strategic priorities: invest in value chains such as rice, cocoa, palm oil, and cassava by promoting agro-processing industries that can add value domestically. Strengthen agricultural extension services and research institutions to improve productivity and climate resilience. Leverage public-private partnerships to attract agri-investments, particularly from diaspora investors and regional markets. Lessons from Africa. Ivory Coast has successfully developed its cocoa and cashew processing industries, reducing dependency on raw exports and increasing value-added exports. Liberia could adapt these models, focusing on local employment and export diversification. Mining, balancing revenue with sustainability. Current state, Liberia's mining sector, particularly iron ore, gold, and diamonds, remains a primary source of export earnings, but faces challenges with revenue management, environmental degradation, and community relations. Strategic priorities: strengthen governance frameworks, like the Liberia Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, LEITI, to ensure accountability and revenue sharing. Promote local content policies that prioritize Liberian employment and local supplier development. Enforce environmental safeguards and community benefit sharing agreements to prevent social unrest. Lessons from Africa. Botswana's diamond model, where revenues are reinvested in public goods like healthcare and education, offers a blueprint for resource-led development with transparency. Energy, powering industrialization and connectivity. Current state. Liberia's energy sector suffers from low generation capacity, high tariffs, and unreliable supply, constraining industrial growth and rural electrification. Strategic priorities. Expand renewable energy investments, particularly in hydropower, solar, and biomass. Prioritize regional power integration through West Africa Power Pool, WAP, to improve grid stability and cross-border electricity trade. Encourage private sector participation in mini-grids and off-grid solutions for rural areas. Lessons from Africa. Kenya's renewable energy investments, particularly geothermal and wind, have made it a leader in sustainable energy, with universal access as a goal by 2030. Liberia could pursue similar ambitions, leveraging green finance. Digital economy, catalyzing innovation and inclusion. Current state. Liberia's digital infrastructure is underdeveloped, with low internet penetration and limited access to e-services. Strategic priorities. Expand broadband infrastructure through public-private partnerships. Promote digital literacy programs, especially targeting youth and women. Develop digital financial services, e-government platforms, and startup ecosystems to foster entrepreneurship. Lessons from Africa. Rwanda's digital economy strategy, including ICT hubs and e-governance initiatives, has positioned it as a tech leader in East Africa. Liberia could adapt these strategies to leapfrog into new economic sectors. Climate resilience. Strategy. Safeguarding Liberia's future. As Liberia charts a path toward economic resilience and sustainable development, integrating climate resilience into its national agenda is not only strategic but essential. The country's vulnerability to climate change, manifested through rising sea levels, coastal erosion, flooding, and deforestation, poses significant risks to its agriculture, infrastructure, and human settlements, particularly in low-lying areas like Monrovia and Buchanan. Key components of Liberia's climate resilience strategy. 1. Strengthening coastal defenses and urban planning. Liberia's coastal cities face mounting threats from erosion and flooding, exacerbated by climate change. Investing in coastal protection infrastructure, such as seawalls, mangrove reforestation, and zoning regulations to limit risky urban sprawl, will be critical. Lessons from Africa. Senegal's Dakar and Mauritius have implemented integrated coastal management plans, combining infrastructure with ecosystem-based approaches. Liberia could adopt similar strategies, especially in vulnerable areas like West Point and Robertsport. 2. Promoting climate-smart agriculture. Given Liberia's heavy reliance on rain-fed agriculture, increasing climate resilience in farming systems is paramount. This includes diversifying crops to reduce dependency on vulnerable species, expanding irrigation infrastructure, promoting agroforestry and conservation agriculture to enhance soil health and productivity. Lessons from Africa. Ethiopia's climate-smart agriculture programs have demonstrated the benefits of community-led watershed management and drought-resistant crops. Liberia could pilot similar initiatives in high-risk agricultural zones. 3. Leveraging climate finance. Liberia has access to several climate finance mechanisms, including the Green Climate Fund, GCF, and Adaptation Fund. By enhancing project preparation capacity and coordination mechanisms, Liberia can tap into these resources to fund renewable energy, reforestation, and resilience-building projects. Examples: Gabon and Kenya have secured substantial GCF financing for forest preservation and renewable energy programs. Liberia, with its extensive forests in the Upper Guinean ecosystem, could leverage carbon credit markets and REDD+ programs to finance climate initiatives. 4. Early warning systems and disaster preparedness. Developing robust early warning systems for floods, storms, and disease outbreaks is vital for minimizing climate-related losses. Enhancing the capacity of the Liberia Meteorological Service and integrating community-based disaster preparedness plans would enhance national resilience. Lessons from Africa. Mozambique, prone to cyclones and floods, has strengthened its early warning and response systems, reducing the human toll of climate disasters. Liberia could model similar community-centered approaches. 5. Integrating climate into national policy frameworks. Liberia's nationally determined contributions, NDCs, under the Paris Agreement, provide a blueprint for integrating climate action across sectors. However, operationalizing these commitments requires mainstreaming climate risk assessments into infrastructure projects, budget planning, and sectoral policies. Example, Morocco has embedded climate adaptation and mitigation into its national development plans, linking infrastructure, energy, and agriculture strategies to climate goals. Liberia can align its post-crisis recovery plans with climate objectives, ensuring long-term sustainability. Public health and education reforms, human capital as Liberia's engine for growth beyond economic diversification and climate resilience. Liberia's human capital development, especially in health and education, will determine its long-term trajectory towards stability and prosperity. The country's experience with the Ebola crisis, 2014-2016, and more recently the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted systemic weaknesses in these sectors. Public health system, strengthening resilience and access. 1. Expanding primary healthcare access. Liberia's healthcare infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, remains limited, with significant gaps in maternal health, child immunization, and disease prevention. Strategic priorities. Strengthen community health worker programs, expanding the reach of primary healthcare services in rural communities. Increase health sector financing, ensuring that at least 15% of the national budget is allocated to health, in line with the Abuja Declaration. Improve emergency preparedness and response systems, including stockpiles of essential medicines and rapid response teams. Lessons from Africa. Rwanda's community health worker system has significantly improved maternal and child health outcomes. Liberia could replicate this model, especially in remote counties like Lofa, Nimba, and Grand Cru. 2. Public-private partnerships in healthcare, encouraging private sector involvement in health infrastructure development, medical supply chains, and telemedicine services could expand access and improve service quality. Example, Kenya's public-private partnerships in healthcare have expanded diagnostic services and hospital management in urban and rural settings. Education reforms, empowering Liberia's youth for the future. Liberia's education sector, long impacted by the civil war and subsequent crises, requires transformative reforms to prepare the country's youthful population, over 60% under the age of 25, for participation in the modern economy. Addressing access, quality, and relevance will be crucial for building human capital that drives economic growth, social stability, and technological innovation. 1. Improving access and infrastructure. Liberia faces significant disparities in education access, especially between urban and rural areas. Many children in remote regions remain out of school, while others face challenges related to overcrowded classrooms, poor infrastructure, and limited teaching materials. Strategic priorities: invest in school infrastructure, particularly in rural counties, ensuring safe, inclusive, and gender-sensitive learning environments. Expand school feeding programs to boost enrollment and retention rates, especially for girls. Enhance teacher training programs, focusing on pedagogical skills, content mastery, and digital literacy. Lessons from Africa. Ghana's free senior high school policy has increased secondary school enrollment, while Ethiopia has expanded community-based education programs to reach pastoralist communities. Liberia could adapt these models to expand access and reduce educational disparities. 2. Curriculum reform and skills development. Liberia's current curriculum remains largely theoretical, lacking alignment with labor market demands. Reforms should emphasize practical skills, technology integration, and entrepreneurship to equip students for productive employment. Strategic priorities: integrate vocational and technical education, TVET, into secondary schools, focusing on agriculture, construction, information technology, and renewable energy sectors. Foster public-private partnerships to design workplace-based training programs that link education to employment opportunities. Promote digital education platforms, expanding access to e-learning, particularly in remote areas. Lessons from Africa, Kenya's competency-based curriculum, CBC, and South Africa's TVET colleges have successfully aligned education systems with industry needs. Liberia could collaborate with regional partners to benchmark and adapt these reforms. 3. Promoting gender equality in education. Girls in Liberia continue to face barriers to education, including early marriage, pregnancy, gender-based violence, and cultural norms. Addressing these issues is essential for inclusive development. Strategic priorities. Implement gender-sensitive policies that ensure safe learning spaces for girls, including sanitation facilities and anti-harassment mechanisms. Launch scholarship programs for girls in science, technology, engineering, and math (STEM) fields. Engage communities and traditional leaders to advocate for girls' education. Lessons from Africa. Sierra Leone's radical inclusion policy, which allows pregnant girls to remain in school, offers a progressive model Liberia could emulate alongside community sensitization campaigns. 4. Leveraging technology for education access. Liberia's digital divide hampers access to e-learning platforms and remote education, particularly in rural areas. However, technology offers significant potential to expand education access. Strategic priorities. Partner with telecommunication companies to provide affordable internet and digital devices to schools and students. Develop national e-learning platforms, offering interactive courses, teacher resources, and assessment tools. Train teachers and students in digital literacy, preparing them for participation in the digital economy. Lessons from Africa, Rwanda's One Laptop Per Child (OLPC) program, and Kenya's Digital Literacy Program illustrate how public-private partnerships can bridge the technology gap in education. Regional integration, strengthening Liberia's economic and diplomatic positioning. Regional integration offers Liberia an opportunity to diversify its economy, expand markets, and bolster diplomatic influence. By actively engaging in West African and continental initiatives, Liberia can leverage trade agreements, infrastructure projects, and diplomatic platforms to enhance its global competitiveness. 1. Maximizing opportunities under the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. Liberia's participation in the AFCFTA, which seeks to create a single African market, can open up access to regional value chains and new export markets. Strategic priorities. Develop trade facilitation infrastructure, including customs modernization, port efficiency, and trade corridors with Guinea and Sierra Leone. Strengthen local industries, particularly in agriculture processing and manufacturing, to capitalize on duty-free access to regional markets. Support small and medium enterprises, SMEs, with capacity building, financing, and export promotion services. Lessons from Africa. Kenya and Morocco have successfully integrated into regional value chains, enhancing industrialization and job creation. Liberia could position itself as a regional hub for agri-processing or logistics. 2. Enhancing transport and energy connectivity. Regional infrastructure projects, such as the Trans-West African Coastal Highway and the West African Power Pool, WAPP, offer Liberia opportunities to improve trade connectivity and energy security. Strategic priorities. Prioritize completion of road corridors linking Liberia to Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. Expand cross-border energy projects, integrating into the WAPP to ensure reliable electricity supply. Develop joint transport and trade hubs at border crossings, facilitating cross-border commerce. Lessons from Africa. East Africa's Northern Corridor, linking Kenya to Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan, has significantly improved regional trade flows. Liberia could replicate such frameworks for intra-West African trade. 3. Deepening diplomatic engagement within ECOWAS and the AU. Strengthening Liberia's diplomatic positioning within ECOWAS and the African Union, AU, will be crucial for shaping regional policies and mobilizing support for national priorities. Strategic priorities enhance Liberia's leadership roles within ECOWAS committees and AU bodies, particularly on peace and security, governance, and climate change. Foster bilateral diplomacy with key West African and continental partners to build alliances and support for initiatives such as the UNSC bid. Engage in regional mediation efforts, reinforcing Liberia's image as a peace builder. Lessons from Africa. Nigeria and Ghana have leveraged diplomatic leadership within ECOWAS and AU to advance national interests. Liberia can deepen its diplomatic footprint to influence regional decisions. Financial sector reforms, building a stable and inclusive economy. Liberia's financial sector, though gradually expanding, remains underdeveloped, limiting access to credit, investment capital, and financial services for businesses and households, particularly in rural areas. Strengthening the sector is critical for mobilizing domestic resources, supporting entrepreneurship, and fostering inclusive growth. 1. Enhancing financial inclusion. A significant portion of Liberia's population remains unbanked, relying on informal financial systems. Expanding access to savings accounts, microcredit, and mobile money can empower small businesses, farmers, and women entrepreneurs. Strategic priorities. Support mobile banking and fintech solutions to reach rural communities. Strengthen microfinance institutions and encourage credit unions as alternative financial providers. Implement financial literacy programs, particularly targeting women and youth. Lessons from Africa. Kenya's M-Pesa revolutionized mobile money services, boosting financial inclusion. Liberia could expand partnerships with telecom companies to scale similar models. 2. Strengthening regulatory frameworks. Building trust and stability in the financial system requires robust regulatory oversight and risk management. Strategic priorities. Strengthen the Central Bank of Liberia's CBL capacity for bank supervision, monetary policy management, and financial stability. Promote capital market development, creating investment vehicles like government bonds or diaspora bonds to mobilize long-term financing. Enhance anti-money laundering, AML, and counterterrorism financing, CFT frameworks to meet global standards. Lessons from Africa. Ghana and Nigeria have successfully developed bond markets and banking regulations that attract investment capital. Liberia can adopt best practices to strengthen financial governance. 3. Promoting public-private dialogue in finance. Ensuring that financial sector policies reflect the needs of the private sector and consumers is essential for effective reform. Strategic priorities. Establish a financial sector development council to facilitate dialogue between government, banks, investors, and civil society. Encourage diaspora investment forums focused on banking, real estate, and agriculture finance. A message to African leaders. Liberia's ongoing constitutional crisis offers valuable lessons not only for its own governance and development trajectory, but for African leaders at large. The continent's aspirations for sustainable development, peace building, and global leadership are deeply intertwined with domestic governance standards, institutional strength, and respect for the rule of law. Key messages. 1. The rule of law is non-negotiable. Judicial independence and constitutional governance are the bedrock of stable democracies. Disregard for court rulings, as seen in Liberia's legislative impasse, undermines not only domestic peace, but also international credibility. African leaders must strengthen judicial systems, ensuring rulings are enforced without political interference. 2. Economic stability depends on governance. Investor confidence, economic resilience, and job creation are closely tied to political stability. Liberia's experience shows how governance crises can derail economic progress and threaten development gains. African governments must prioritize transparency, anti-corruption reforms, and inclusive economic policies to drive growth. 3. Regional integration strengthens sovereignty. Active participation in regional frameworks like ECOWAS, AFCFTA, and the AU enhances economic and diplomatic leverage. Liberia and other African nations must seize these opportunities to diversify economies, expand markets, and bolster diplomatic influence. 4. Peacebuilding is an ongoing process. Post-conflict nations like Liberia must remain vigilant, continuously strengthening institutions, reconciling divisions, and investing in human capital. Youth empowerment, education reforms, and security sector professionalism are crucial to maintaining peace. 5. Africa's global influence begins at home. Aspirations for global leadership, whether through UNSC bids or diplomatic initiatives, hinge on domestic governance credibility. Liberia's situation is a reminder that soft power, built on democratic norms, peaceful conflict resolution, and economic cooperation, is Africa's pathway to shaping the global order. As Liberia stands at a crossroads, its choices today will define its future role in West Africa and the world. African leaders must recognize that governance, regional solidarity, and visionary leadership are the pillars upon which Africa's prosperity and global standing rest. It is not only Liberia's defining moment, it is a call to all African nations to reaffirm their commitment to democracy, development, and unity. Let Liberia's experience serve as a beacon of reflection and a catalyst for action across the continent. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV. What's your take on Liberia's crisis? Can President Boakai salvage Liberia's credibility? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more bold conversations and critical analysis across Africa. And hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that shapes our continent's future. Remember, together we make the difference. Stay bold, stay informed.